Welcome back to the Introduction to the Mass Professional Standards for Teachers of Adult ESOL. In Part 1, we talked about the development of the standards and the recent revisions, and we took a brief look at the organization of the document and the standards at a glance. In Part 2, we will take a closer look at each one of these standards. Our goals for this session are that by the end, you will know enough about the standards to be able to summarize them, as well as the key revisions made to each one. Here are the 7 standard topics again, shown somewhat randomly. However, the standards are organized quite deliberately. In Standards 1 and 2, on the principles of second language acquisition and the components of language respectively, lay the foundational knowledge on which the other standards are based. In the center, you'll see Standard 6, Instructional Delivery. It is in the center, and it comes after the other standards because it is in the classroom where all of the other standards come into play. As noted in the previous video, the standards are all interconnected and you'll see some ideas repeated. This is by design, to reinforce key concepts and practices and to present them through a different lens. Now let's take a closer look at each standard. Standard 1 covers how second languages are learned and by extension how they are best taught. It states that ESOL teachers understand current theories and principles of second language acquisition and applies this knowledge to promote adult learners' English language development. This standard was revised quite a bit to emphasize teacher knowledge of these principles as well as their application in the classroom. Note that understands current theories and principles as well as applies this knowledge. Teachers who meet this standard are able to explain the principles behind effective practices and to understand why some practices are more effective than others. It helps teachers to understand the question, what research-based practices inform my teaching? This standard identifies 9 key SLA principles and provides a brief supporting explanation for each one, as well as sample applications of what each principle looks like in the ESOL classroom. The standard also includes recent research on the brain and learning, specifically how this research informs language learning and instruction. For example, learner recall, repetition, productive struggle, and creative original language production have all been shown to play an important role in language acquisition and have informed the field of SLA. Here are the SLA principles included in Standard 1. The importance of authentic, meaningful communication for language acquisition. The difference between learning about a language and acquiring it. The role of comprehensible input, that is, speaking and providing text appropriate to the proficiency level of the learner. And comprehensible output, the central role that students' language production plays in their acquisition of the language. Knowing what to expect of learners at different proficiency levels, and the process of acquiring a language which includes something called interlanguage. The role that emotions play, called the affective filter in our field. And all of the other factors that come into play, the variables in learners' experiences, temperaments, attitudes, all inform their language acquisition. And finally, the principles of BICS and CALP, that is, the difference between basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency, is important for ESOL teachers to know and apply in their planning and instruction. You can read more about these principles in the supporting explanation of the document and see some sample applications in the Know and Do chart. Standard 2 states that the ESOL teacher understands the components of language and the structure and conventions of English and uses this knowledge to inform instruction. Standard 2 covers the linguistic features of the language, like its grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, all of which English teachers should obviously know. Again, you can see the expectation is that teachers will both understand and use this knowledge in their instruction. Here is a summary of the components. As you can see, the linguistic terms are identified in both technical and informal terminology, and you'll find a more complete description of each one in the document. You'll also see examples of how to teach pronunciation, vocabulary, basic literacy, contextualized grammar, appropriate forms, etc., using evidence-based approaches, including some examples of how to teach more rigorous and complex language to help English learners meet their academic and professional language needs. Standard 3 is culturally responsive and sustaining teaching. It states that the ESOL teacher understands the importance of culture in language learning and creates a culturally responsive and sustaining classroom where students' diverse backgrounds, identities, strengths, and challenges are valued and incorporated into an inclusive learning environment. This standard underwent perhaps the most significant revisions of all. You may recall that in the previous version, Standard 3 was simply intercultural awareness. The bar was raised from this because it has become apparent that adult ESOL students need to be equipped with the skills and knowledge not only to navigate systems and overcome barriers, but also to become empowered to advocate for themselves and change the systems if needed. We want them to develop agency, capability, skills, and confidence that go beyond awareness and towards civic engagement and action. CRST is an approach that fosters this development. These aspects of CRST are elaborated on in the standards document, but let's go through briefly what CRS teaching looks like. First of all, it is a classroom environment that is inclusive and equitable because research shows that this fosters student engagement and motivation. And if you know about SLA principles of the affective filter, then you know that this kind of classroom environment also fosters language acquisition. I'm sure you all do this to a certain extent, but through the CRST lens, it means taking the time to learn about your students' individual cultures, countries of origin, backgrounds, identities, and present circumstances. That is their culture in its broadest sense, and that you acknowledge them, and that you recognize them as assets and strengths to be appreciated and explored in the classroom. For example, being bicultural, bilingual, or multilingual are assets, and learners benefit from being able to draw on their additional cultures and languages in class and not having to speak English only. This might seem like a departure from what you've thought. I know I used to insist on English only when I taught ESL, but the evidence is that learners benefit from being able to use the tools and skills they have to think and process information. They also benefit from having their skills affirmed as assets. They also benefit from learning about the cultures of their classmates and about diverse perspectives and materials on various aspects of culture, including the diverse cultures in the U.S., not just the dominant ones. And also to think critically about them. CRST includes having sometimes difficult class discussions about social justice and how one can be civically engaged even if one is not a citizen. Understanding and communicating complex ideas often requires complex language in the form of complex texts and syntax, nuanced vocabulary, and appropriate discourse. So CRST in the ESOL classroom necessitates rigorous instruction that enhances language development. And finally, to create a CRS classroom, teachers need to reflect on their own beliefs and culturally informed values and on how these influence their instructional decisions and their students' learning. This is truly central to the CRST model and is ongoing. You may look at these and think they're just best practices in teaching, and they are. But CRST is very intentional about centering instruction on the cultural identities of learners and about sustaining all of the elements of the approach. It is not a one and done, but rather something that is built into the curriculum, lesson planning, classroom environment, relationships, and professional and program development. So again, Standard 3 has significantly raised the bar for what is expected of ESOL teachers in terms of culture. Which brings us to Standard 4, Curriculum and Instructional Planning. Standard 4 states that the ESOL teacher designs coherent, rigorous instructional units and lessons that include measurable learning outcomes, optimize student interaction, support the needs of all learners, and are guided by SLA principles and aligned to the Mass ALPS. Whew, that is a mouthful, but let's break it down a bit. The standard was revised with a focus on 4 areas. The process of instructional planning using the backward design approach. Backward design starts with first determining learner outcomes, followed by identifying how students will demonstrate their learning, and then creating a learning plan. This process leads to an instructional plan in which all parts are aligned and provided with a structure that is cohesive and coherent, the second area discussed in Standard 4. All parts of a curriculum and instruction plan should connect internally. The objectives, assessments, standards, and activities of unit and lesson plans are aligned to one another. And also how the parts of curriculum, the scope and sequence, unit plans, and lesson plans all connect to one another within and across the levels to create a cohesive and coherent curriculum. Third, specific elements of an effective instructional plan are identified in the standards, such as contextualizing language objectives and meaningful, engaging content, including culturally diverse material, and providing sufficient rigor and critical thinking to support learners' college and career readiness. Finally, planning for remote instruction was added to this standard as well. Standard 5 focuses on assessment and states that the ESOL teacher uses a variety of formative and summative assessments to inform and evaluate instruction, develop differentiated learning experiences, measure student learning, and promote learner metacognition. This standard includes all kinds of assessments: needs assessments, student self-assessments, formative and summative assessments. Teachers are expected to conduct assessments to get to know their students' needs, goals, and levels, and to inform their instruction and measure learning. But a key revision to this standard is an emphasis on the importance of assessment for the learners. Research in the fields of neuroscience and education has shown that learners who see and understand their own progress and areas of need become more strategic about their own learning. They build self-efficacy and metacognitive skills for learning in general and for the language acquisition in particular. So throughout the standard, you will see references to sharing assessment results with learners, making progress visible to them, providing feedback, as well as student assessments such as recall activities and reflections. Standard 6, Instructional Delivery, is where all of the previous standards come into play. The standard states that the ESOL teacher facilitates language learning by using a variety of rigorous instructional methods and relevant materials that optimize student engagement, encourage productive struggle, foster critical thinking, and address diverse needs, interests, and levels of readiness. Note that this is quite packed, as it identifies several key elements of effective ESOL instruction. This chart organizes all of these elements into 3 categories, sometimes referred to as the 3 R's: relevance, rigor, and relationship. Relevant and inclusive instruction is culturally diverse and contextualized in meaningful content. Rigorous instruction promotes critical thinking, is accessible to all learners, and material is scaffolded as needed. It also includes a gradual release of responsibility for learning to the learners, and assessments regularly conducted and results clearly communicated. And effective ESOL instruction is engaging and interactive. This is the relationship part, where students are involved in collaborative and communicative learning opportunities. Teacher talk is limited and modified, and corrective feedback is provided judiciously. The last standard is Standard 7, Professional Growth. The ESOL teacher engages in a continuous improvement process that includes ongoing reflection, self-assessment, goal setting, and high-quality professional development in order to gain greater teaching expertise, develop new instructional practices, increase learner engagement, and improve student outcomes. This standard went through significant revisions as well, raising the bar for teachers to where they are now expected to play an active role in their own professional development and in sharing responsibility for student learning. The standard now highlights specific strategies teachers can employ to improve their effectiveness, such as cultivating a reflective practice, reviewing student and program data, collaborating with colleagues and their program director, and participating in high-quality professional development. This PD model has been formalized by ACLS in their Educator Growth and Effectiveness Cycle, EGE, where teachers and their program directors work together on educator growth using the professional standards as a jumping-off point. And that's it for our closer look at the ESOL professional standards. If you haven't done so already, we encourage you to take the self-assessment found on the ACLS and SABE's websites, and to peruse the whole standards document or choose one of the standards in particular, and then watch the final video in the series. In the final video, we discuss what you can do to make good use of the standards. We'll see you there, and thank you so much for joining us.